In the hallowed halls of a Dallas, Texas courtroom, where the air hums with the gravity of law and the faint creak of wooden benches, Jasmine Crockett stands poised. A young black attorney with a fire in her voice and a case that could shift lives. She's mid-argument, her words slicing through the tension of a tenants' rights hearing, when Judge Edward Lawson leans forward, his gavel hovering like a threat. With a sneer that cuts deeper than silence, he spits, "Maybe you'd be better off in a hair salon, Miss Crockett." The room gasps, pens freeze mid-scratch, and the sting of his words hangs heavy, a public wound meant to diminish her. On a chilly winter afternoon in Dallas, Texas, the courtroom exuded an atmosphere of austere formality and quiet tension. The vast room, with its high ceilings and walls paneled in dark, polished wood, held an air of centuries-old tradition. The wooden benches creaked softly beneath the weight of waiting spectators, and a persistent musty aroma of aged paper and dust mingled with the subtle tang of disinfectant. The low hum of the air conditioner created a continuous, almost rhythmic backdrop to the proceedings, while beams of natural light filtered weakly through tall, narrow windows, casting elongated shadows across the courtroom floor. In the midst of this solemn stage, Jasmin Kroket, a young black attorney with a determined glint in her dark eyes, stood confidently at the plaintiff's table during a pivotal tenants' rights hearing. Clad in a tailored navy suit that complemented her poised composure, she had spent countless hours preparing her case, and her voice carried with clarity as she began to present her meticulously constructed legal arguments. Every word was chosen with precision, and her tone was both calm and forceful, a stark contrast to the icy environment that threatened to numb the senses. But just as Jasmine was in the midst of articulating a particularly compelling point, the commanding voice of Judge Edward Lawson cut through the air like a razor. With barely concealed disdain, the judge interrupted her, his tone dripping with sarcasm and condescension as he sneered, "Miss Kroket, maybe you'd better go back to the hairdresser instead of wasting my time with these nonsense arguments." His words echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings, reverberating around the packed courtroom and drawing an immediate, shocked silence. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to freeze in disbelief. The stern expressions of the jurors deep in concentration, the anxious rustle of legal documents being shuffled by assistants, and even the restrained breathing of the audience all colluded to underscore the shock of that public humiliation. Reporters in the press gallery exchanged startled, hushed whispers while cameras continued to record the unfolding drama. Every eye was fixed on Jasmine, and in that pivotal moment, the honor and pride she held in her work collided with the sting of the judge's cruel remark. Despite the verbal assault, Jasmine's face remained stoic. Internally, a fire raged behind her composed exterior, a mix of indignation, righteous anger, and an almost palpable determination not to be belittled in this sacred hall of justice. Though her heart pounded like a drum in her chest, and she could feel the warmth of fury rising, she clenched her fists so tightly that the skin around her knuckles paled, yet she said nothing in response. Instead, she allowed a brief, resolute silence to pass. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, flickered briefly as she steadied herself, unwilling to let the judge's sneer define her worth or undermine the strength of her argument. For a long, suspended moment, the air itself seemed to thicken with tension, the judge's words lingering as a discordant note amid the otherwise steady rhythm of the courtroom proceedings. It was a moment that encapsulated the deep-seated biases that had long festered within the corridors of power, and at the same time, it marked the beginning of a quiet revolution in Jasmine's heart, a determination to reclaim her dignity no matter the cost. As silence reigned, the soft sound of the judge's gavel struck in the distance, echoing like a reminder of the authority that now hung in the balance. The courtroom, once a place where legal arguments were expected to be met with respect, now buzzed with a mix of shock, disapproval, and a growing anticipation of what would come next. Jasmine's fingers were white from clenched resolve, and though she offered no immediate retort, the defiance in her eyes promised that her voice would not be stifled. In that fleeting, charged instant, as the moment stretched painfully between judgment and hope, the seeds of change were quietly sown in the hearts of those present. An unspoken call for justice that, once awakened, could not be easily ignored. The courtroom's heavy silence was shattered when Jasmine Crockett, still seething with quiet defiance, reached into her sleek leather briefcase and pulled out her smartphone. With steady hands, she pressed the play button, and immediately, the crisp audio of a recorded conversation filled the room. The recording, captured secretly minutes before the hearing, revealed a moment when Judge Edward Lawson, away from prying eyes and microphones, had made derogatory remarks. His voice was cold and laced with contempt as he sneered, "You know, a girl like you, sassy from the ghetto, should really mind her business instead of wasting the court's time." The words, harsh and unforgiving, echoed in stark contrast to the solemn decorum of the courtroom. "As you just heard, Your Honor, you did more than merely interrupt my argument. You insulted me based on my race and gender, undermining the very integrity of these proceedings," Jasmine declared, her voice unwavering despite the palpable tension. Her eyes darted across the room, meeting those of shocked spectators, fellow attorneys, and even a few members of the jury whose expressions revealed a mix of horror and disbelief. With each syllable, she transformed her personal pain into a rallying cry for justice. The recorded evidence, broadcast over the courtroom's sound system, sent ripples of murmurs throughout the room. Some onlookers gasped audibly, while others exchanged incredulous glances, as if confirming that this was the moment long denied by the establishment. Jasmine's tone, calm yet firm, resonated with the conviction of someone who refused to be silenced by arrogance. "Your actions in that private conversation have not only crossed the line, they have deeply wounded the fundamental principles of equality and respect our community deserves," she continued. "I now request that, in light of this incontrovertible evidence, immediate action be taken to hold you accountable for your unethical behavior." At that, the tension in the courtroom became almost electric. A nearby bailiff, who had been watching the unfolding drama with growing concern, stepped forward to assess the situation. Jasmine handed him her phone along with a neatly organized dossier containing not only the damning recording but also additional documents, confidential testimonies from minority community members, and a formal letter from the local bar association warning about Judge Lawson's habitual prejudices. The documents were crisp and official, their contents too tangible to be dismissed as mere hearsay. As the recording played a second time, Judge Lawson's face flushed crimson. His earlier sneer had dissipated into a mask of mounting anger and disbelief. "This is utter slander," he bellowed, his voice ricocheting off the courtroom's paneled walls. His outburst, however, was drowned by Jasmine's resolute counter. "I stand here before you not as a victim but as an attorney who demands that justice be served. Your personal bias, revealed so clearly by your own recorded words, cannot and will not be swept under the rug." The slight tremor in his tone betrayed his growing panic as he realized that the evidence was both overwhelming and public. The intensity built rapidly as the courtroom's occupants leaned forward, their collective gaze fixed on Judge Lawson. Attorneys hushed their murmurs, and even the most stoic jurors could not hide their shock. The judge attempted to protest further, his voice cracking, "This is all a misunderstanding." But his protest was cut off by the stern command of a senior bailiff who announced, "Court is adjourned for a brief recess while this matter is reviewed." At that announcement, a mixture of relief and simmering tension filled the room. Every eye was now on Judge Lawson as he struggled to regain composure. The undeniable playback of his private contempt, the irrefutable testimonies detailed in the dossier, and the ringing declaration from Jasmine had flipped the power dynamic in the courtroom. His enraged face contorted with fury and humiliation, a volatile mixture that suggested the beginning of the end for his unchecked arrogance. In that charged pause, as the judge fumed internally and outwardly, the courtroom braced itself for the impending reckoning. The atmosphere was now thick with the promise of accountability, and the echoes of Jasmine's calm defiance reverberated as a testament to the principle that no one is above the law. Jasmine's steady gaze did not falter as she continued her confrontation with Judge Lawson. With deliberate calm, she reached into her briefcase and retrieved a thick file folder, its cover embossed with the insignia of the local bar association. Carefully, she opened it to reveal a series of printed documents. Formal testimonials from fellow attorneys, written statements from community members who had previously experienced or witnessed Lawson's discriminatory behavior, and a strongly worded letter from the Bar Association itself warning that his pattern of racist comments and unethical conduct was both unacceptable and in violation of judicial ethics. "Your Honor, if you will look at this," Jasmine said firmly, her voice resonating through the tense courtroom. She slid one of the papers toward the bailiff, ensuring it was projected via the document camera onto the large screen at the front. The image showed clear, dated entries detailing episodes of Lawson's past misconduct, remarks made during private conversations and even in informal staff meetings, all recorded and later transcribed by trusted colleagues. The letter, written in an authoritative tone and signed by the head of the Bar Association, stated unequivocally that repeated complaints had been lodged against him and that his continued service was jeopardizing the integrity of the court. At the sight of these documents, a palpable shift began to ripple through the courtroom. The jurors leaned forward, their faces etched with renewed curiosity mixed with disbelief. Reporters scribbled furiously, while attorneys exchanged looks of grim satisfaction. But Judge Lawson, whose earlier outburst had already stirred the chamber, now reacted with mounting panic. "Objection!" he bellowed, his tones straddling the line between indignation and desperation. "This is all fabricated. These documents are nothing but slander and hearsay. I demand that this evidence be thrown out." His voice, normally resonant with the unwavering authority expected from someone in his position, trembled ever so slightly as he tried to regain control of the situation. His eyes darted wildly around the room, seeking, perhaps, an ally among his peers or a moment of reprieve from the accumulating evidence. But Jasmine was unyielding. "Your Honor, these are not fabrications," she replied, her tone icy with determination. "These are the very records and testimonies that have been hidden from public view for far too long. They reveal a pattern, a systematic abuse of power and prejudice that you have fostered under the guise of judicial discretion." Each word was delivered with precise clarity, and the courtroom air grew heavy with the weight of truth. With the documents now open for all to see on the projection screen, Judge Lawson's protest became increasingly frantic. He stammered, I maintain that my conduct has been professional and within the bounds of decorum. These records are taken out of context." His feeble defenses only heightened the tension, and the murmurs of discontent from the public and the jurors grew louder. The evidence, both visual and printed, built an inexorable case against him. In that charged moment, Jasmine's resolve shone unmistakably. "Your actions and actions of your office have been repeatedly documented," she said. "The evidence, your own recorded private remarks, these signed statements, and the formal warning from the Bar Association, proves beyond a reasonable doubt that you have consistently violated the ethical standards of the bench." Her words hung in the air like a challenge that could neither be ignored nor easily refuted. As Judge Lawson's face flushed with both rage and terror, the atmosphere in the courtroom became virtually electrified. Tension radiated from every corner of the room where each witness, juror, and reporter now reflected the seismic shift in power. Every sound, the soft rustle of paper, the intermittent beep of equipment, the hush of countless collective breaths, seemed to mark the turning of a historic moment. Even before any formal motion could be moved, the gravity of the evidence cast an unavoidable shadow over Lawson's earlier proclamations. It was in this moment, just as Judge Lawson's protests reached a fever pitch, that a senior bailiff stepped forward, ready to execute the next order. The air crackled with anticipation and the unspoken promise of accountability, as the room braced for the inevitable consequences of a judge's actions laid bare under unrelenting scrutiny. The tension now reached its apex, setting the stage for what would immediately follow, a moment when the scales of justice would be irrevocably tipped in favor of truth. The atmosphere in the courtroom reached a fever pitch as the weight of irrefutable evidence fully compromised Judge Lawson's position. Moments after Jasmin Kroket's pointed declaration, a senior bailiff stepped forward with a firm, commanding presence. The serious tone of his voice, laced with the authority of the law, resonated through the hushed room. "All due procedures are now in effect. Judge Lawson, please step aside." For a few long seconds, silence reigned over the room as even the most skeptical onlookers seemed to hold their collective breath. Judge Lawson's once defiant expression had dissolved into one of panic and shame. His attempts to regain control had failed now, with every set of eyes in the courtroom fixated on him. He was visibly trembling. The recorded evidence and the damning dossier that Jasmine had presented left no room for argument. In a final futile effort to protest, Lawson shouted, "This is all slander. I demand an immediate review. My rulings have been fair." But his voice, hoarse and unconvincing, was quickly drowned out by the resolute murmur of the bailiff repeating the order. Within moments, a second wave of officers promptly moved in. With methodical precision honed by years of enforcement protocol, they approached Lawson from both sides, their uniforms neat and expressions impassive. As one officer placed cold, metal handcuffs around his wrists, a ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. The judge's face, once flushed with anger, now drained to a pale, defeated hue. Every detail was caught by the recording devices of journalists in the press gallery and by the eyes of the jurors, whose expressions mixed disbelief with a cautious hope for long overdue accountability. Once restrained, Judge Lawson was escorted carefully to the side of the courtroom. Amid the low clatter of footsteps and murmurs from the spectators, Jasmin Kroket slowly stepped forward to address the assembled crowd. Her voice, steady and imbued with a quiet yet determined authority, cut through the remaining tension. "Ladies and gentlemen of this court," she began, her tone clear and resolute. "Today we witnessed what happens when power is wielded irresponsibly and when prejudice is allowed to slither into the halls of justice. Justice is not about status or personal biases. It is about truth, accountability, and the steadfast protection of every human being's dignity." Her words, simple yet searing, hung in the air as every individual in the room absorbed their meaning. The gallery was silent except for the gentle sound of papers rustling and the occasional cough. Jasmine's eyes scanned the audience, meeting the gaze of a few sympathetic jurors, fellow attorneys, and even some reporters, whose faces reflected both relief and sober acknowledgement of the moment's gravity. "I stand before you not as a victim, but as a defender of justice," she continued, her voice rising with passion. "Let this moment serve as an unmistakable reminder that the courtroom does not tolerate discrimination, that every official here is accountable to the same lofty standards of fairness and respect. We, as a society, will no longer allow those in positions of power to hide behind false pretenses of authority when they violate our values." As Jasmine spoke, the atmosphere shifted further. The silence in the courtroom, heavy moments before, now echoed with a sense of shared purpose. The image of Judge Lawson, flanked by uniformed officers, his eyes lowered in defeat, was projected onto the court's large screen. Every whispered conversation ceased, replaced by a reverent hush that acknowledged the profound accountability being meted out. In her final words, Jasmine's voice softened slightly yet retained its indomitable force. "Justice does not fear the truth. Today, we have shown that when the truth is revealed, even those who presume themselves invincible must answer for their actions." With that, she paused as a moment of collective realization spread through the room, a culmination of righteous anger and hope for restorative changes in the justice system. At that instant, the judge's presence was formally nullified in that courtroom. With the silencing of his protests, the officers carefully ushered him out, his heavy steps echoing down the polished corridors as if the very walls of the courthouse were bidding farewell to an era of unchecked disdain. The removal of Judge Lawson was not merely a procedural act. It was the unambiguous dismantling of a long-established pillar of prejudice that had cast a dark shadow over the proceedings. The courtroom, still palpable with the charge of what had just transpired, came to understand that the scales of justice had been irrevocably shifted. Every face captured by the cameras bore a look of solemn satisfaction, knowing that the truth, no matter how inconvenient to those in power, had ultimately won. The moment marked a turning point, a promise that the institution of justice would stand as a bulwark against bias and abuse, ensuring that every voice is treated with the respect and dignity it deserves. As the evidence was meticulously reviewed and the testimonies of several brave witnesses sealed the case, the presiding authority in the courtroom shifted with stark finality. After a brief recess that seemed to stretch into eternity, a senior judge from the appellate division entered the chamber, and an air of resolute expectation rippled through the packed courtroom. In a voice that blended gravitas with a quiet, unyielding firmness, the judge announced, based on all the undeniable evidence presented, from the recorded private remarks to the written testimonies and official complaints, it is hereby ordered that Judge Edward Lawson be suspended from his position with immediate effect. A collective gasp filled the room, punctuated by the solemn clatter of papers and hushed whispers among jurors and spectators alike. It was a moment that resonated deeply through the hallowed halls of justice, a moment in which bias and unchecked authority had been cast down by the relentless pursuit of truth. Jasmin Kroket, still standing at the front of the room, felt her heart swell with a mix of vindication and bittersweet triumph. Her steady, measured tone in challenging the prejudice and abuse had not only forced the fateful exposure of Judge Lawson's misconduct, but had also lit a spark that would ignite sweeping reforms across the judicial system. Today, she declared, addressing the court and those present with a voice that trembled with both emotion and unshakable resolve, we have proven that justice cannot be undermined by personal bias. Every person, regardless of their skin or gender, deserves to be treated with fairness and respect in these sacred halls. Let this serve as a reminder that truth, when pushed to the light, will always prevail. Her words, articulated with clarity and passion, seemed to vibrate within the very air of the courtroom, leaving an indelible mark on all who heard them. As the announcement echoed, the gallery became a living canvas of stunned expressions and whispered conversations. Reporters scrambled to capture every nuance on their recorders, while members of the public exchanged glances filled with awe. The verdict was not merely procedural. It symbolized the shattering of a long-held legacy of prejudice. In that charged moment, the courtroom's somber decor, the wooden benches that creaked under the weight of history, the lingering scent of dust mingled with the sharp tang of ink, seemed to bear silent witness to the triumph of accountability over tyranny. Outside the courtroom, the ripple effects were already stirring in Dallas. Within minutes of the judge's suspension, local news outlets began broadcasting the scandal with headlines such as "Bias Exposed," "Judge Lawson Suspended After Racist Remarks Revealed," and "Justice Takes a Stand in Dallas. Young attorney Jasmine Crockett leads historic victory." Social media was instantly ablaze, as ordinary citizens and activists alike hailed the decision as a turning point in the battle against institutional racism. The community, long burdened by whispers of injustice, now felt a surge of hope and empowerment, a collective declaration that no one, however distinguished, was above the law. Meanwhile, in the wake of the suspension, Jasmine's client, a long-suffering tenant whose rights had been trampled upon, secured a resounding victory for a case that was emblematic of broader social injustice. With the judge's biased influence removed, the case for housing rights was heard with newfound fairness under a temporary judge specially appointed to oversee it. The courtroom, still reeling from the charged events, buzzed with the news that justice had been served, and that the tenant's appeal would ultimately be successful. Brief exchanges among the attorneys and supportive nods from the gallery underscored the fact that this victory was not just personal but a symbol for an entire community that had weathered years of neglect and discrimination. In the midst of all this, Jasmine stood quietly, her gaze locked on the screen displaying the judge's final order of suspension. As the murmurs and exclamations of approval from the audience melded with the resolute finality of the gavel's echo, the weight of the moment settled into the room like a promise of a better tomorrow. Jasmine's inner thoughts swirled with a mixture of relief and quiet determination. She knew that while this was a victory, it was only the beginning of a long and challenging road toward reform. Yet, as she looked around the courtroom, catching glimpses of awestruck expressions and supportive smiles, a profound conviction reasserted itself. The relentless pursuit of justice and equality, however arduous, was a battle worth fighting for. As the courtroom slowly emptied amid the buzz of a system in transformation, the headlines now beating across television and the internet declared a new era in Dallas. A moment when one brilliant, unyielding voice had forced prejudice into the shadows. For those present, and for countless others inspired by the outcry. This day would be remembered as the moment when justice truly reigned, heralding change that promised to ripple far beyond the confines of that solemn room. In the weeks after the dramatic courtroom showdown, the reverberations of Judge Lawson's suspension and the courageous stand by Jasmin Kroket spread like wildfire throughout Dallas. The echo of that fateful day still lingered in every whispered conversation in the courthouse corridors and on city streets. Local news stations ran in-depth segments documenting the scandal, and headlines such as "Justice Reclaimed," "Dallas Court Shatters Bias," and "Young Attorney's Courage Sparks Systemic Change" dominated the evening news. The story had become a rallying cry for reform, and community organizations began holding forums to discuss accountability and the fight against prejudice in every facet of governance. Jasmine, once subjected to the sting of condescension in that hallowed courtroom, now found herself hailed as a beacon of integrity and resilience. Her fearless presentation of irrefutable evidence had not only exposed Judge Lawson's repeated abuses, but had also ignited a much-needed reevaluation of outdated systemic policies. In the aftermath, the local bar association publicly commended her, placing her image alongside other champions of justice in a series of community awards. Fellow attorneys reached out with supportive messages, and student groups organized discussions on the importance of ethical leadership and respectful treatment in the justice system. Meanwhile, the probe into Judge Lawson's conduct deepened. An independent review board was established, and over the next several months, investigators pored over archived dashcam footage, collected testimonies from countless witnesses, and uncovered a long history of discriminatory remarks and actions. It soon became clear that Lawson's behavior was not an isolated incident but part of a larger pattern of abuse and prejudice that had shielded him for too long. The final report was scathing. Not only was he suspended indefinitely, but his judicial license was ultimately revoked. In the corridors of power, there was a palpable shift as officials vowed to implement more stringent policies on ethics, transparency, and bias prevention throughout the entire judicial system. Amid these reforms, a renewed ethos of accountability began to pervade Dallas' legal community. Public meetings and town halls were convened to discuss the changes, with community leaders calling for ongoing vigilance against any form of discrimination. The scandal had not just removed an individual from power, it had spurred a nationwide dialogue on justice and equality. Social media exploded with hashtags such as #JusticeForAll, #EndBias, and #StandWithJasmine, and ordinary citizens found their voices emboldened to speak out against injustice wherever they encountered it. In a final ceremony held at the Dallas courthouse, a senior judge formally announced the new measures that would be instituted, emphasizing transparency and community engagement. Today marks not the end, but the beginning of a new standard in our justice system. The judge proclaimed, his voice firm yet compassionate. Let the events we witnessed serve as a powerful reminder that prejudice can be dismantled when truth is revealed and integrity prevails. The words resonated strongly with the crowd of legal professionals, civil activists, and community members who had gathered to bear witness to this turning point. Back in her modest office, Jasmine opened the window to watch the Dallas skyline glitter under the muted sunset. In that quiet moment, she reflected on the harrowing events and on the strength it had taken to stand up against an entrenched system of bias. Her heart swelled with a mix of relief and determination. Though the battle against discrimination was far from over, she now believed that one brave act could indeed change the course of history. Her courage had set in motion a chain of events that would continue to inspire others. Those who had once felt small under the weight of systemic injustice now had a voice. And so, with the scales of justice having finally tilted toward truth and fairness, the community of Dallas began to heal. New policies took root, bonds were forged among those committed to creating a more equitable future, and the story of that winter day in the courthouse remained a powerful reminder that accountability is not just a legal principle but a moral imperative. I hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment, sharing your thoughts about it. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new and equally exciting stories. See you in the next video.